The Western Desert is a vast expanse of wilderness that hugs the shores of North Africa's Mediterranean coastline. There is little here to sustain life, let alone an army. And yet it was into this inhospitable wilderness that thousands of men and armor poured to fight some of the toughest battles of the Second World War. Not only did they have to fight each other, but they also had to fight the elements. Soaring temperatures by day, followed by freezing nights. To add to their torment, the troops were hounded by millions of flies. Even a mild bruise could develop into a nasty, infected desert sore. Then there were the violent desert storms, the Khamsin that could rage for days, blowing gritty sand into everything, making any movement all but impossible. For 3 years, the fortunes of both sides ebbed and flowed across hundreds of miles of desert. The British and her Commonwealth allies on one side, the Italians and Germans on the other. The campaigns were more akin to naval battles in which tanks replaced ships. There was nothing else to get in the way, no civilian population or significant geographic features, just thousands of square miles of scrub and sand. But dominating the region was the soaring ridge that rises up from Saloum on the Egyptian border. There were only 2 routes through here, the coast road from Bardia to Saloum, or inland a narrow pass at Halfaya. This was the area where the fighting would be its most intense. Benghazi, Tobruk, Saloum, Sidi Barrani, and of course El Alamein would become familiar names to people thousands of miles away in Great Britain. The conditions created a kind of common bond between the opposing armies. And although the fighting was some of the most bitter in any theatre of war, there were remarkably few instances of atrocities. By June 1940, Germany dominated Europe. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated off the beaches at Dunkirk following Germany's devastating blitzkrieg that had swept through the Low Countries and France. With her army decimated, Great Britain faced defeat. Then on June the 10th, 1940, the Italians, under fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, declared war on Britain. It was an opportunistic action designed to shore up his status as an equal partner in his alliance with Adolf Hitler. Control of the Mediterranean was central to his dream of building a new Roman Empire. Italy already had a presence in Libya, but the countries that form the southwestern edge of the Mediterranean, Palestine and Egypt, were under British control, as was the vital Suez Canal. If Mussolini's vision was to see light of day, he would have to defeat the British in Africa. With Britain so isolated in Europe, it seemed that the task would be easy. But by the summer of 1940, Britain had a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill believed that if British forces were at least seen to be fighting back, the United States just might be persuaded to come in on Britain's side, as she had done in the First World War. To this end, Churchill was prepared to divert what few resources were available to try and maintain the British presence in North Africa, even though it meant having to transport supplies and men over thousands of miles by sea. The war at sea would play a critical role in the battle for North Africa, and in this, the Italians had a substantial advantage. The Italian fleet had a substantial presence in the Mediterranean and included 6 battleships, as well as numerous cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. The British fleet in the Mediterranean was tiny by comparison. It had no battleships and only a handful of cruisers and destroyers. But from its bases in Gibraltar and Alexandria in Egypt, the Royal Navy was able to dominate the Mediterranean. But there was to be no set-piece, decisive naval battle in the Mediterranean, for despite its numerical advantage, the Italian Navy refused to fight. Also, the British fleet had one important advantage over the Italian Navy. It had aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers were to become the new capital ships during the Second World War, and it was an audacious attack against the Italian fleet in November 1940 that was to set the seal on this new kind of warfare. On the night of November the 28th, 1940, some 20 fairy swordfish flying from the aircraft carrier Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet in its home port of Taranto in southern Italy. Attacking in two waves, these obsolete biplanes wrought terrible damage on the Italian ships. The Italian Navy had no carriers, and future operations were to be dogged by a sense of vulnerability. However, Italy had a powerful air force with over 2,000 frontline aircraft in the Mediterranean. Its fighters and bombers were to pose a serious threat to Allied shipping and ground forces in the first years of the war. Allied air power was limited to what little could be spared from the home front. A handful of squadrons of Wellingtons, Blenheims and Marylands bombers could only provide a minimal striking force, while equally few Hurricanes and Gladiators could not be expected to win air superiority. Limited though its capabilities were, the Western Desert Air Force was to play a vital role during the desert campaigns, often supported by Fleet Air Arm aircraft. Italy began its campaign in North Africa by invading British Somaliland from Abyssinia on August 3, 1940. The Italians had some 300,000 men, 400 guns and 200 aircraft. Against them stood a small British force of a few thousand lightly armed men. Inevitably, they were soon driven out of the country. British Somaliland was important because it was at the southern tip of the Red Sea. If Italy could dominate all the countries in the region, it would be in a good position to threaten the Suez Canal. It would also be able to threaten the whole of the Middle East. Emboldened by his success in East Africa, Mussolini decided that now was the time to strike at a more important part of the British Empire, Egypt. On September the 13th, the Italians invaded Egypt from Cyrenaica, Libya's northeastern province, even though this was against the better judgment of the Italian commander in Libya, Marshal Italo Balbo. The great pre-war aviator and national hero was far from convinced that the British were beaten and did his best to delay any invasion eastwards. But on the 28th of June, he was shot down and killed over Tobruk by his own anti-aircraft gunners. It was not until September that the Italian forces felt that they could risk such a strategy. On September the 13th, 1940, an Italian army of some 250,000 men, tanks and aircraft crossed the border and made their way eastwards along the coast road. Waiting for them were the 30,000 men of the Western Desert Force under the overall command of Sir Archibald Wavell. In 1940, the British defence line was anchored on Mersa Matruh. From here, Wavell's men would be able to use the open southern flank to launch attacks on the long, vulnerable Italian columns as they made their way along the road. At Sidi Barrani, the Italians stopped. Several weeks were spent laying a pipeline and road, as well as encampments around the town. For the British, it bought time. Reinforcements in men and equipment, including 3 tank regiments, were sent out from England at a time when the home defences could least afford them. With his forces strengthened, Wavell planned strikes in the Western Desert and East Africa. The desert attack, codenamed Operation Compass, was launched on the night of the 8th of December 1940. It was originally envisaged that the operation might be a raid in strength to undermine Italian morale. The attack on Sidi Barrani was launched by a force of British, Indian and Australian units. Their first objective was the fortified camps 20 miles to the south of the town. The camps fell within hours, and some 20,000 Italians taken as prisoners of war. The British and Commonwealth forces now pushed on into Cyrenaica itself. The fortified town of Bardia soon fell, followed by the valuable harbour of Tobruk. Compass was barely a month old, and already 100,000 prisoners of war had been taken. But the force's commander, General Richard O'Connor, was eager to press on and defeat what was left of the Italian 10th Army. At Beda Fom, to the south of Benghazi, the Italians met their fate. After 2 days of bitter fighting, the Italians had had enough. O'Connor's force of 30,000 men had covered over 500 miles and had taken 130,000 prisoners. It was the British Army's first taste of victory following many defeats during the first year of war. However, O'Connor was to be denied the opportunity of marching on to take Tripoli itself. The cream of his force was sent to Greece to try and prevent the Germans and Italians overrunning the Balkans. It was a fool's errand that was to end with defeat in Crete and yet another ignominious evacuation. With the momentum lost, O'Connor was ordered to adopt a defensive position. In the meantime, Mussolini had appealed to Hitler for help. In response, Hitler sent possibly his finest general, Erwin Rommel, and the first units of what became the Afrika Korps. Rommel lost no time in launching his first attack at Mersa Brega on the 31st of March 1941, with 2 Italian and 1 German division. By launching his attack before adequate forces had been built up, Rommel hoped to secure a quick victory, and so bring more support from Hitler and further reinforcements. The timing of Rommel's arrival could not have been worse for the British. O'Connor had been hospitalized in Cairo, and much of his experienced command replaced with units that were untrained and ill-equipped for desert warfare. What's more, they were under strength and unable to withstand the combined force of German and Italian divisions. In order to try and stabilize the situation in Cyrenaica, O'Connor was sent from Egypt. But disaster struck when on April the 7th, O'Connor stumbled into a German reconnaissance patrol and was taken prisoner. The port of Benghazi was given up as the Allies fell back in panic on Tobruk, which was already occupied by the Australian 9th Division. On April the 13th, Rommel mounted a hurried assault on Tobruk's outer defences. He was soundly beaten back, suffering substantial casualties in the process. But he had been reinforced by the arrival of the 15th Panzer Division, who now occupied the area around Saloum. It meant that Tobruk was effectively surrounded. Tobruk was to become synonymous with the Desert War, as the garrison held out for months while the Germans and Italians besieged this vital port. German and Italian aircraft would harass the defenders for the next 8 months, almost on a daily basis. neither side was able to gain the upper hand because both faced enormous supply problems. But on May the 15th, the Western Desert Force attacked in the Solun-Capuzzo area in an attempt to clear the escarpment above Halfaya Pass. The success of the Germans under Rommel was beginning to have a detrimental effect on the morale of the troops. And at home, the British public began to wonder how could the army that had driven the Italians out of Cyrenaica so decisively just 3 months earlier be so roundly defeated. Churchill would have none of it and ordered that a counterattack be mounted immediately. Wavell protested that he simply was not ready. It was to no avail. To underline his wishes, Churchill ordered that a convoy carrying a cargo of 220 tanks be sent through the risky waters of the Mediterranean rather than round the lengthier Cape route. The tanks were mainly Matildas, which had proved so successful in the first year of the war, but were now beginning to look obsolete. Its 2-pounder main gun was to prove useless in the armour versus armour contests that were to follow. Operation Battle Axe was launched on June the 15th. It took just 2 days for the plan to be added to the litany of failure. Not only did the Germans have superior armour, but they also began using the 88mm anti-aircraft gun against British armour, inflicting heavy losses. The failure of Battle Axe cost Wavell his command. In his place came General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck, or the Auk as he was known, quickly found himself on the wrong side of Churchill as well, when he resisted pressure to mount a fresh offensive. Without the confidence of his political master, Auchinleck's tenure on his position was always going to be weak. But Auchinleck refused to allow himself to become pressured into resuming the offensive, and gradually he built up his forces. Meanwhile, Tobruk was being held by a largely Australian garrison. The conditions were appalling, and German propaganda taunted them that they were living like rats. To the Australians, this turned into a source of great pride, and the legend of the Rats of Tobruk was born. Throughout the long, hot North African summer, the two sides glowered at each other. After his initial attacks had failed, Rommel spent the summer months reorganizing and preparing. Endless air attacks by Stukas only added to the garrison's discomfort. Axis forces in Cyrenaica totaled 102,000 men with around 400 tanks. During the summer, most of the Australians holding out in Tobruk were relieved by a composite British formation, the 70th Division, and the Polish Carpathian Brigade. By November 1941, Auchinleck was finally ready. Operation Crusader was to be the debut of the newly created 8th Army. Crusader's first objective was the relief of Tobruk and to drive the Axis forces out of Cyrenaica. By capturing the Cyrenaican airfields, some of the pressure could also be taken off Malta, which was suffering repeated air attacks by Italian and German bombers. Malta was a vital strongpoint, and its relief meant that the Mediterranean could be reopened for convoy traffic. Meanwhile, Rommel had gone to Rome to seek permission to attack Tobruk between the 15th and 21st of November. But on November the 18th, the Allies struck first. As dawn brushed the horizon, Operation Crusader began. One part of the 8th Army was to move on Tobruk, while another part attacked further south, with the aim of bringing the Axis armour to battle and destroying it. It was then to link up with the besieged garrison, which had begun its own attempt to break out. In the days that followed, the battle became a fluid series of encounters, as each side attempted to block the other from their main forces. But Rommel was not convinced that this was the main Allied attack, and so he busied himself with preparations for his attack on Tobruk. He ordered his armour to concentrate in the areas between the British forces and the Egyptian frontier. But the breakout of Tobruk by the 70th Division soon made him change his mind, as his forces now faced attack from behind. The garrison force began to open up a narrow corridor to the southeast. Rommel moved his panzers to the high ground on a ridge called Sidi Rezegh. The ridge and its airfield became the scene of bitter fighting, as both sides attempted to win control of this valuable vantage point. But the plan to link up with the garrison force began to run into trouble. Although they had done well to reach El Duda, some 4 miles to the southeast of Tobruk, it was facing much stronger opposition than had been anticipated. A bitter struggle ensued to keep the corridor open. By the morning of the 23rd, the ridge at Sidi Rezegh was in German hands. The Allies had barely 160 tanks left, many of which were scattered about the desert. Rommel resolved to destroy the Allies in a pincer movement and thus relieve his frontier garrisons. Over 250 German and Italian tanks advanced towards the British, who also had the 21st Panzer Division behind them. At 3 p.m, the attack began, but the British armour, although badly mauled, was not beaten yet. 72 panzers were knocked out, and at point 175, the New Zealanders took over 400 casualties before being stopped 6 miles east of Sidi Rezegh airfield. Then, in a bold move, Rommel decided to launch a dash to the border. But logistics, always a weakness with Rommel, had not been properly worked out. The panzers ran out of fuel, ammunition, and water. As Rommel made his dash, the New Zealanders headed for Tobruk. They managed to occupy Sidi Rezegh after tough fighting. At the same time, the garrison force had extended their corridor just enough to link up with units from the 8th Army. But Rommel, realizing that his dash for the border had been a mistake and that the situation around Tobruk was becoming perilous for the Axis forces, ordered his army to turn around and make for Tobruk as quickly as possible. But exhaustion was overtaking both sides. The British, however, were receiving fresh reinforcements and new equipment. On December the 10th, Rommel, realizing that he did not have the strength to continue, withdrew his forces back into Tripolitania to regroup his forces. Operation Crusader had been a battle of nerves, and it had been Rommel who had lost his first. But events on the other side of the world were about to change the course of the war forever. Japan attacked the US Pacific Fleet in its Hawaiian base of Pearl Harbor. Now, Britain and her Commonwealth allies would no longer have to fight the war on their own. With America's industrial might turned to war production, the tide would surely turn. For Winston Churchill, it was, in some sense, vindication of his determination to hang on to North Africa. But the success of Operation Crusader was to be short-lived. Rommel's armour had not been destroyed, and large numbers of reinforcements were arriving in Tripoli. On the 21st of January 1942, the Axis forces attacked. Although British armour outnumbered the Afrika Korps by 2 to 1, they were taken by complete surprise. The British were easily defeated and chased from the battlefield in total disarray. A week later, it was Benghazi's turn. Again, the attack was completely unexpected and the defenders routed. The loss of Benghazi was a severe blow to morale, as once again British troops were forced to flee eastwards. They coined their own laconic description of this seemingly endless ebb and flow, the Benghazi Stakes. At Gazala, west of Tobruk, Rommel halted in the face of British defences that had been drawn up in previous months. The defensive system consisted of a series of loosely held locations, or boxes as they were called. Each box was held by infantry, artillery and anti-tank guns, but were spaced so that armoured units could manoeuvre easily between them to provide support where and when needed. Unfortunately, these boxes were too far apart, and communications between them soon broke down. Rommel was giving the British a masterclass in mobile warfare. On May the 26th, Rommel launched his attack on the Gazala line. At the same time, an attempt was made to outmaneuver the southern flank at Bir Hakeim. Here, the Afrika Korps ran into tough opposition from British armour, whose firepower had been improved by the arrival of the American-built Grant tank. The Grant was twice as fast and had double the range of the Matilda, which had been Britain's main heavy tank. The Grant's 75mm gun was also much more powerful, but his main gun was mounted in a pontoon on the side, which meant that it could not be easily traversed, limiting its potential on the battlefield. Although the Axis attack at Gazala and Bir Hakeim was being held, British armour was being deployed piecemeal, with little or no coordination between infantry and armoured brigades. But Rommel was also experiencing problems. British armour concentrated in the Knightsbridge box meant that Rommel was dangerously close to being separated from his supply trucks at Bir Hamat. Conventional thinking would have made Rommel pull back to protect his logistical tail. But instead he renewed his attack on the 28th, pushing past Knightsbridge towards El Adem. A determined counterattack by British armour failed to break the Afrika Korps. By nightfall on May the 29th, the Axis armour was beginning to concentrate in an area some 5 miles southwest of Knightsbridge called the Cauldron. This shallow depression was the scene of some of the most desperate fighting on June the 5th, as British forces mounted yet another counterattack using infantry, armour and artillery. The Afrika Korps was almost encircled and their supplies were stretched. Initially, things went well for the British, but once again, coordination between infantry and armour broke down. Also, British artillery fire, normally so devastating, had failed to make significant impact on the Axis forces as they were further to the west than had been thought. Confusion reigned, and the initiative passed to the Axis. By nightfall on June the 6th, the Cauldron was lit by the fires of over 200 burning British tanks. 8th Army had also lost an infantry brigade and 4 artillery regiments. Rommel's victory at the Cauldron now gave him the strength he needed to press home the offensive. His supply routes were secure, and although tired by the speed and piecemeal nature of the fighting, the confidence of the Afrika Korps could not have been higher. 8th Army, by contrast, was shattered. The infantry morale, having taken yet another hammering, began to look distrustfully at their armour. Rommel now turned his attention towards Bir Hakeim, defended by Free French forces. For 10 days, the French withstood ferocious attacks, but they could not hold out forever. No attempt was made by the British to reinforce this vital position, and so it fell, leaving the way clear for Rommel to roll up the British defensive line. Tobruk once more faced the prospect of being besieged. But this time it was not to be. The Navy had made it clear that it was unable to conduct the kind of resupply operations it had carried out the year before. Auchinleck had also made it clear that he expected 8th Army to hold a line that would prevent the ports becoming invested. As a result, Tobruk's defences had been allowed to fall into disrepair. In June 1942, Tobruk's survival depended on strong support from a force operating in the area of El Adem and Bel Hamid. But the final action of the Gazala battles saw 90 British tanks charging into action against 2 panzer divisions of Afrika Korps. Over 30 tanks were lost in this desperate action, and on June the 18th, Tobruk was surrounded. This time, Tobruk held out for less than 24 hours. At 6 a.m. on June the 21st, 1942, the garrison surrendered. 32,000 prisoners of war, of whom 19,000 were British, passed into Axis hands. The fall of Tobruk was a terrible blow to British morale. Churchill was in America and was given the news by President Roosevelt in the White House. One beneficial side effect was that Roosevelt authorized the immediate release of 300 new Sherman tanks. British forces now withdrew to Mersa Matruh inside Egypt, where a new defensive line had been planned. But with an exposed southern flank and insufficient armour to prevent such an outflanking manoeuvre, it was likely that the rout of Gazala was going to be repeated. 8th Army commanders had determined that there would be no more retreating, that they would fight here or die. But there was to be no last stand. Auchinleck flew up from Cairo and took over direct command of 8th Army, as he had done the year before. He had already decided that there would be a withdrawal to a new defensive line at El Alamein. El Alamein was chosen because it is only 80 miles from the coast to the Qattara Depression, which is a great sand sea through which vehicles could not pass. Although defences had been prepared, 8th Army had retreated in some disarray and was totally demoralised. The challenge for Auchinleck was to galvanise this force to stop Rommel in his tracks. On July the 1st, Rommel attacked at El Alamein. For the next 2 weeks, he was to mount repeated attacks in an attempt to annihilate what was left of the 8th Army. Auchinleck had prepared his defences well. His battle plan was that the army should hold key positions. This would then channel any enemy advance. The rest of the army was to remain as mobile as possible in order to hit the flank and rear of any attack. As the Afrika Korps was repeatedly thrown back, 8th Army began attacking Italian positions where it was felt morale was weak due to poor leadership and stretched supply lines. By the middle of the month, the equivalent of 2 Italian divisions had been removed from Rommel's order of battle. But poor coordination between armour and infantry meant that 8th Army was unable to drive home any advantages it had won. Churchill, alarmed by what he perceived as a total lack of progress, flew out to Cairo to see for himself. It was a pivotal moment. Churchill had made up his mind that the Middle East land forces needed some new blood. Auchinleck was removed as the Middle East's commander-in-chief and replaced by Sir Harold Alexander. General Bernard Law Montgomery was appointed to take command of the 8th Army. A new era was about to begin, and the stage set for the showdown between 2 of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. Montgomery faced his first taste of desert battle on July the 1st, when Rommel struck again, this time at Alam Halfa. Rommel's plan was to fight another Gazala, a feinting frontal attack accompanied by a forceful attack on the enemy's flanks, hitting his lightly defended rear and supply areas. But Montgomery was ready for him. By drawing Rommel in at Alam Halfa, Montgomery was hoping to destroy his armor by attacking it on 3 sides. The plan worked, and the defeat of Rommel at Alam Halfa restored some of the Eighth Army's lost confidence. But there was still much to be done before Montgomery could consider mounting his first proper offensive. More and more reinforcements of men and equipment arrived from England, having made a journey that lasted some 6 to 8 weeks. New Sherman tanks arrived to replace the armor lost in the previous months. Rommel, too, was busy rebuilding his forces after the setback at Alam Halfa. His supply lines were considerably shorter, but they were vulnerable to attack by Allied bombers. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator attacked the ports and roads. Strike aircraft, like the Bristol Beaufighter, roamed the skies looking for surface vessels. The Royal Navy also engaged supply ships. In August, some 80% of Axis shipping was sunk. Once Montgomery's new forces were ashore, they began a rigorous program of training, and yet more training, regardless of rank or job. If the Eighth Army was to defeat the Afrika Korps, its men would have to be at their peak of physical fitness in order to endure the tough conditions and demands that lay ahead. Rommel concentrated his strongest forces in the north and south, leaving the center deliberately weak. With his confidence sky high, he returned to Berlin, where he was feted and promoted to Field Marshal. Meanwhile, at British headquarters in Cairo, Admiral Harwood, Air Marshal Tedder, and General Alexander continued their planning for the forthcoming battle. A new spirit of cooperation and mutual support existed amongst the 3 services. In the desert, Montgomery and Air Vice Marshal Cunningham worked closely together on their detailed planning. This unity of command would make a significant contribution to the Allied success in North Africa. But as Montgomery's battle plan developed, it became clear that only a frontal assault would be feasible. He made sure that his aims and objectives were known by everyone from the top down. The Allies planned to attack in the center to bring Rommel's armor into battle. Once engaged, the tanks would be picked off from the flanks, while the main force would push through and attack his artillery and lines of communication. Throughout the long, hot desert summer, final preparations were made. Finally, on October the 23rd, everything was as ready as it could be. For the men now in their start positions, these were tense hours, to be filled in any way possible. As the sun set, tension rose. Tonight they would attack. 0 hour was to be 10 p.m. But at 9:30 p.m. there was to be an artillery barrage, the likes of which had not been witnessed since the First World War. Sappers would be sent through to begin clearing paths through the minefields, marking their routes with white tapes. At 9:30 p.m., a barrage of nearly 1,000 guns announced the opening of Operation Lightfoot. The Battle of El Alamein had begun. The barrage, which could be heard in Alexandria, 60 miles away, caught some sections of the German lines completely by surprise. The first phase was a feinting attack to the south in order to fool Rommel into believing that this was the main attack. But it was in the far north that the main thrust was to take place. In the weeks leading up to the attack, the battle plan had been revised, following the realization that the Axis weak points lay where the Italian and German forces overlapped. It was at these points that the most intense attacks were directed. But despite the surprise, the German defenses soon got themselves organized and began to mount counterattacks. Rommel ordered his panzers northwards, where the Allies had pushed forward, to help his beleaguered infantry. In the days that followed, the tide of battle hung in the balance, as the Eighth Army mounted attacks up and down the enemy's line, gradually forcing him off balance. On November the 1st, the battle entered its final phase, as the Allies mounted an attack on the panzer's southern flank. Codenamed Operation Supercharge, the aim was to mount a major attack in the north, catching the engaged panzers off balance. Rommel, sensing disaster, cabled Hitler seeking permission to disengage and withdraw. His request was denied. But as his losses mounted, an increasingly disillusioned Rommel once again requested permission to withdraw. This time, his request was granted. The chase was now on, as Rommel's forces began streaming westwards. But this was no headlong retreat. As Montgomery and the Eighth Army were to discover in the weeks that followed, Rommel was able to conduct a masterful withdrawal. Time and time again, he would meet his pursuers head-on with just enough strength to stop them before melting away into the desert. Bad weather also hampered progress, but Montgomery was not to be rushed. In Britain, El Alamein was greeted as a great victory. For the first time since the war began, the church bells rang in celebration. The victory marked a turning point in the war. As the Eighth Army pursued the Afrika Korps across the desert, landings began in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Operation Torch, launched on November 8, 1942, was the first joint landing featuring British and American troops. Their aim was to push eastwards, ultimately to squeeze the Axis forces from the west, while the Eighth Army held them in the east. On November the 11th, Algiers signed an armistice. The next target was Tunisia. If Tunisia were to fall, then Rommel would find himself wedged between Allied forces to the west and east. For the newly formed Allied First Army, the attack on Tunisia was not going to be easy. There were few roads and maps were poor. Also, there was little information about the enemy's dispositions. The hilly terrain very much favoured the defence, as the advance on Bizerta and Tunis slowed in the face of repeated counterattacks. The Germans were flooding the region with reinforcements from Italy and Sicily, while British and American supply lines became increasingly stretched the further east they advanced. Meanwhile, Eighth Army pursued Rommel westwards. At one point, near Mersa Matruh, they nearly had him, but heavy rain intervened and Rommel slipped away, his retreat orderly and disciplined as ever, ready to seize an opportunity despite being outnumbered. Montgomery, on the other hand, was cautious and refused to be hurried. He would fight this campaign on his terms and on his terms alone. On November the 12th, Tobruk was once again in Allied hands. The port would help shorten the Allies' logistical tail. At El Agheila, it looked as if Rommel might make a stand. There were many within the ranks of the Eighth Army who held their breath. They had been here twice before. But once again, Rommel slipped away. All along the route, sappers and engineers had to search out mines and booby traps left by the retreating Axis forces. But following the recapture of Cyrenaica, the Eighth Army set its sights on its next objective, Tripoli. Rommel's retreating Afrika Korps were constantly attacked every step of the way. As the Allies approached Tripoli, just 79 days after the Battle of El Alamein, they found themselves in a land of contrasts. Behind them lay the rocky desert, ahead of them the fertile plains. Finally, on January the 23rd, 1943, Tripoli surrendered to Montgomery. For Montgomery, the satisfaction of accepting the surrender of Tripolitania from the province's vice-governor was tinged with regret at having not destroyed Rommel's armour. The Italian Empire in North Africa may have come to an end, but there was still some unfinished business to attend to. Axis forces were now regrouping in Tunisia. With the Allied First Army completely bogged down, it was beginning to look as if the Eighth Army would have to finish the Germans off in North Africa. But Rommel, realizing that he was at risk of being caught between the two armies, struck first. He launched his attack against the 2nd US Corps at the Kesserine Pass on February the 14th, because he believed the Americans were inexperienced and would therefore be easily beaten. He was nearly proved right, but for a determined counterattack led by British armour and artillery. Then, on February the 16th, the 8th Army entered Tunisia. Before them lay the Mareth Line, defences built by the French before the war to protect themselves from possible Italian invasion from Libya. To the northwest, the Allied First Army had made some great gains across Tunisia and now threatened Rommel's line of retreat. Thanks to decoded messages, Montgomery already knew that Rommel was planning to attack him. Montgomery's plan of attack was similar to that of El Alamein, in that there would be an intense artillery barrage followed by a diversionary attack at the front. At the same time, the powerful attack was to be mounted on the left flank. On the night of March the 20th, 1943, the barrage began. The 50th Northumbrian Division led the attack on the enemy's frontal defences. There was severe fighting as they struggled to get tanks across the wadis that formed natural anti-tank ditches. Rommel, fearing another El Alamein, rushed his armour up to counter the threat. At this point, Montgomery decided to shift the emphasis of the main attack to the left flank, which was spearheaded by General Freyberg's New Zealand Division and the 1st Armoured Division. With excellent coordination between infantry, armour and air force, the Allies launched their first blitzkrieg attack of the war. Waves of aircraft pounded enemy positions as tanks rolled forward. By the 28th, the 8th Army had crushed the defences of the Mareth Line. As thousands of prisoners streamed south, the 8th Army headed north towards Tunis. All along the way, the engineers had to rebuild roads left in ruins by the retreating Germans in their attempt to slow the Allies down. By the first week of April, 1st and 8th Armies were able to link up and form a continuous line, hemming in the Axis forces with their backs to the sea. Their symbolic meeting showed up some stark contrasts. The men of the 8th Army came as veterans of 3 years of fighting. Their vehicles were battered and sand-coloured, and their dress almost casual. In contrast, 1st Army vehicles were freshly painted green, and its troops wore formal battle dress. Not surprisingly, then, that there should be some antagonism and rivalry as to who should have the final honours. The final attack, codenamed Vulcan, began on May the 4th. It was launched by the 1st Army, reinforced with Montgomery's 2 veteran divisions, the 4th Indian and 7th Armored. For the Axis forces, it was a last desperate stand. An attempt was made to evacuate them by sea, but the convoys were easy prey for the Royal Navy and Allied aircraft. On May the 7th, the 1st British and Commonwealth forces entered Tunis, while Bizerta fell to the Americans. The following week, overall German commander von Arnim surrendered what was left of the Axis forces. Over 200,000 German and Italian prisoners were taken, prompting Goebbels to compare the catastrophe with Stalingrad, which had fallen at the beginning of February. General Alexander was able to cable Churchill with the news: "We are masters of the North African shore."